little girl, was dying for blood. Then a Hell's Angel walked in and said, "Take mine." The early morning light filtered weakly through the half-drawn blinds of room 312. 6-year-old Ellie Carter lay still against the white hospital sheets, her small frame barely making a bump under the thin blanket. Her skin was nearly as pale as the pillow that cradled her head, and her once vibrant blonde curls lay limp against her forehead. The steady beep of the heart monitor provided a mechanical rhythm to the otherwise silent room. Various tubes connected Ellie to machines that hummed and blinked, their colorful screens displaying numbers that kept falling despite the doctor's best efforts. Sarah Carter sat in the vinyl chair pulled close to her daughter's bedside, her fingers gently wrapped around Ellie's tiny hand. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of too many sleepless nights spent in this same position. Her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but her eyes remained alert, watching every small movement of her daughter's chest as she breathed. "Please, God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines. "Please help my baby girl." The words formed a prayer she had repeated countless times since they'd arrived at the hospital 3 days ago. What had started as unusual fatigue and bruising had quickly spiraled into a nightmare diagnosis, a rare blood disorder that was ravaging Ellie's body from the inside out. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Sarah reached up to brush a curl from Ellie's forehead, her touch feather light against the child's clammy skin. Ellie's eyes fluttered at the contact, but didn't open. "Good morning, sweet pea," Sarah murmured, forcing a smile, even though Ellie couldn't see it. "The sun's coming up. It's going to be a beautiful day." The lies came easily now, small comforts spoken into the sterile air of the hospital room. Outside the window, the sky was actually gray and threatening rain, but Sarah couldn't bear to acknowledge anything but hope, however false. A soft knock at the door made Sarah straighten her posture. A nurse with kind eyes and graying hair stepped into the room carrying a clipboard. "Morning, Mrs. Carter. How's our little fighter doing?" Sarah swallowed hard. She had a rough night. Fever spiked again around 2. The nurse nodded sympathetically and moved to check Ellie's vitals. Her practiced hands moved efficiently, adjusting tubes and noting numbers. "The doctor will be in shortly," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "He wants to discuss the latest lab results with you." Something in the nurse's tone made Sarah's heart quicken. "Is it bad?" The nurse paused, then patted Sarah's shoulder. "Dr. Williams will explain everything." With that, she slipped quietly from the room, leaving Sarah with a growing knot of dread in her stomach. Sarah turned back to Ellie, squeezing her hand gently. "Did you hear that, sweetheart? The doctor's coming to see us. Maybe he'll have good news." Ellie remained unresponsive, her breathing shallow. The minutes crawled by. Sarah watched the wall clock tick past 7, then 7:30. Outside in the corridor, she could hear the hospital coming to life. Carts wheeling past, nurses changing shifts, the distant ding of an elevator. At 8:15, Dr. Williams entered the room. He was a tall man with premature gray at his temples and wire-rimmed glasses that he adjusted nervously as he approached. He carried Ellie's chart and a somber expression. "Mrs. Carter?" He greeted her quietly. "Please," Sarah said, not letting go of Ellie's hand. "Just tell me straight." Dr. Williams pulled up another chair and sat across from Sarah, their knees almost touching in the cramped space. "Ellie's condition has deteriorated overnight," he began, his voice gentle but direct. "The medication isn't working as we'd hoped. Her body is rejecting our standard treatments." Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. "What does that mean? What's next?" "She needs a blood transfusion," Dr. Williams explained. "But not just any transfusion. Ellie's blood type is rare, and more importantly, because of the nature of her condition, we need a very specific match, one without certain antibodies that could trigger a reaction." Sarah leaned forward. "Take my blood. I'm her mother." "We've already tested you," Dr. Williams reminded her gently. "You're not a match. We need someone with blood type AB negative with the K antigen absent. It's extremely rare. How long? Sarah's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. How long do we have to find a match? Dr. Williams removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Hours, not days. I've put out an emergency request to the blood bank and surrounding hospitals, but I need to be honest with you, Mrs. Carter. The chance of finding a perfect match in time is very slim. The room seemed to close in around Sarah. The beeping of the machines grew louder in her ears, as panic clawed up her throat. There has to be something, she whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Please, she's all I have. A whisper of hope. The midday sun finally broke through the clouds, casting rectangular patches of light across the hospital room floor. Sarah hadn't moved from Ellie's bedside, her legs numb from sitting in the same position for hours. The conversation with Dr. Williams had left her hollow, like someone had scooped out her insides and replaced them with cold dread. A soft moan escaped Ellie's lips, and Sarah jerked to attention. Ellie? Sweetie, can you hear me? Ellie's eyelids fluttered, but remained closed. Her small chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple despite her cold skin. Sarah pressed the call button frantically. Within seconds, a young nurse with copper hair tied back in a ponytail rushed in. Her breathing changed, Sarah explained, the words tumbling out. And she made a sound. The nurse, her badge read Jenny, quickly checked Ellie's vital signs, her expression carefully neutral. I'll get Dr. Williams, she said, hurrying from the room. Before Sarah could process what was happening, the room filled with medical staff. Dr. Williams led the group, barking orders as nurses moved with practiced efficiency around Ellie's bed. They adjusted IV bags, checked monitors, and spoke in clipped medical terms that Sarah struggled to understand. BP's dropping, one nurse called out. O2 sat at 89, said another. Push 5 cc of... Dr. Williams began, but his words blurred as Sarah backed away from the bed, pressing herself against the wall to stay out of their way. Time seemed to stretch and contract. Sarah stood frozen, watching these strangers work to save her daughter's life while feeling utterly helpless. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her mouth, stifling the sobs that threatened to escape. Mrs. Carter. A gentle hand touched her elbow. It was Jenny, the copper-haired nurse. Let's step outside for a moment while they work. I can't leave her, Sarah protested, her eyes never leaving the small form on the bed. Just to the hallway, Jenny insisted softly. You'll be able to see through the window. I promise. Reluctantly, Sarah allowed herself to be guided into the corridor. Through the rectangular window in the door, she could see the medical team still hovering around Ellie. What's happening? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her body is fighting, but it's getting weaker, Jenny explained gently. Without that blood match. She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. But we're not giving up. The blood bank is checking every sample they have. We've put out calls to other hospitals in the region. 2 more nurses hurried past them and into Ellie's room. One carried a small machine, the other a tray of supplies. It's just so rare, a lab technician said as he approached, clutching a folder. He was speaking to another nurse who walked alongside him. AB negative is uncommon enough, but with the K antigen absent, we might have better luck finding a unicorn. Keep it down, the nurse hissed, nodding toward Sarah. The technician had the decency to look embarrassed before they both disappeared into Ellie's room. Sarah felt her knees weaken. Jenny guided her to a nearby chair. Don't listen to him, Jenny said firmly. Rare doesn't mean impossible. But Dr. Williams said, Dr. Williams is preparing you for the worst while hoping for the best. That's his job. Jenny squeezed Sarah's hand. Miracles happen in hospitals every day. I've seen them. Sarah wanted desperately to believe her. Eventually, The flurry of activity in Ellie's room subsided. Dr. Williams emerged, looking tired but slightly less grim. "We've stabilized her for now," he told Sarah. "She's fighting hard." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. As Dr. Williams walked away, Sarah returned to Ellie's room. The crowd had dispersed, leaving just one nurse adjusting Ellie's blanket. Sarah reclaimed her seat by the bed, taking Ellie's small hand in hers once more. The afternoon crawled by. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting equipment. Sarah remained, sometimes talking softly to Ellie, sometimes just watching the rise and fall of her chest, as if willpower alone could keep her breathing. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the room, Sarah's exhaustion finally caught up with her. Her head nodded forward, eyes heavy with fatigue. She fought to stay awake, but her body betrayed her as she drifted into a light, troubled sleep. She wasn't sure how long she'd dozed when voices in the hallway pulled her back to consciousness. Sarah blinked, disoriented for a moment, before remembering where she was. Ellie hadn't moved, the machines still beeping their steady rhythm. The voices outside grew louder. A nurse and someone else, discussing a patient, discussing Ellie. "Poor little thing," the nurse was saying. 6 years old with AB negative, K antigen absent. Dr. Williams says if we don't find a match by tonight." There was a pause then. "It would take a miracle at this point." "Does the mother know how bad it is?" asked the second voice. "I think she understands. She hasn't left that chair except when we made her. The way she looks at that little girl, it breaks my heart." Sarah closed her eyes, fresh tears leaking down her cheeks. The conversation continued, neither speaker aware that every word was driving deeper into Sarah's heart like knives. "If only we could find—" the nurse began, then abruptly stopped. A deep, gravelly male voice interrupted them. "Excuse me." The corridor went silent. A promise. Remembered Jack Callahan stood motionless in the sterile hospital corridor, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as if carrying an invisible weight. He'd just left room 317, where his old riding buddy Pete was recovering from a motorcycle accident. Pete would pull through. They always did. Bikers were tough. They had to be. The harsh fluorescent lights made Jack's weathered face look even more lined than his 45 years had already carved into it. His leather vest, with its faded patches, felt out of place among the scrubs and lab coats that hurried past. A few staff members eyed him warily, giving him a wide berth. Jack was used to that reaction, had come to expect it even. He was about to leave when the conversation between two nurses caught his attention. "Poor little thing. 6 years old with AB negative. K antigen absent. Dr. Williams says, if we don't find a match by tonight." Jack froze mid-step. Something about those words, that blood type, stirred a memory buried deep. He turned his head slightly, listening more intently now. "It would take a miracle at this point," one nurse continued. "Does the mother know how bad it is?" asked the other. "I think she understands. She hasn't left that chair except when we made her. The way she looks at that little girl, it breaks my heart." Jack's hand moved unconsciously to his inner wrist, where a small tattoo of a winged cross was barely visible beneath his leather wristband. He rubbed it with his thumb, a habit he'd developed years ago. "If only we could find—" the nurse began. "Excuse me," Jack interrupted, his voice like gravel. Both nurses turned, startled by the imposing figure before them. One took a small step back instinctively. "I couldn't help overhearing," Jack said, his voice softer now, though still rough around the edges. "You mentioned a blood type. AB negative without the K antigen." The taller nurse, recovering her composure, nodded cautiously. "Yes, but—" "That's my blood type," Jack said simply. The nurses exchanged glances of disbelief. "Are you sure?" the shorter one asked. "It's extremely rare. Less than 1% of the population has AB negative, and without the K antigen, it's even rarer." Jack nodded once. I'm sure. Had to get a transfusion myself once, after a bad accident. They made a big deal about how hard it was to find. The taller nurse still looked skeptical. Well, if you're willing to be tested, we could. I am. Jack cut in. He glanced down the hallway where they had been looking. Which room is the kid in? The nurses hesitated, professional caution warring with desperate need. Room 215, the shorter one finally said. But sir, we'd need to run tests first, and there would be paperwork. But Jack had already turned away, walking slowly toward the room number she'd mentioned. He paused at the end of the corridor, looking back over his shoulder at the still stunned nurses. Well, he asked, aren't you coming to take my blood? The taller nurse hurried after him. Sir, it's not that simple. We need to verify your type, check for diseases. There are protocols. Then start them, Jack said firmly. That kid doesn't have time for red tape. As they approached room 215, Jack slowed his pace. Through the small window in the door, he could see a woman slumped in a chair next to a hospital bed. The bed itself seemed to swallow the tiny figure lying in it. Something twisted in Jack's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He stopped several feet from the door, suddenly uncertain. The nurse who had followed him looked at him curiously. Second thoughts? Jack shook his head. No. His hand went back to his wrist, to the winged cross hidden beneath the leather. Just remembering something. He stood there for a long moment, memories flooding back of a promise made years ago. A promise he'd tried to keep, then tried to forget when it became too hard. Sir? The nurse prompted. Jack squared his shoulders and took a deep breath. Without another word, he started walking again, purpose in every step as he approached Ellie's room. Sarah Carter barely looked up when the door to Ellie's room opened. She expected another nurse or doctor with more bad news, more forms to sign, or worse. That sympathetic look that said they were running out of options. Her fingers remained intertwined with her daughter's small, limp hand, feeling the faint pulse that kept her own heart beating. But this time, the footsteps sounded different, heavier, more hesitant. Sarah raised her tired eyes to see a tall figure standing in the doorway, his broad frame nearly filling it. A man in worn jeans and a leather vest stood there. His face was weathered, with several days of stubble covering a strong jaw. Dark eyes peered out from beneath heavy brows, surveying the room with caution. A Hell's Angels patch was visible on his vest, making Sarah instinctively tighten her grip on Ellie's hand. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of unshed tears. "I think you might have the wrong room." The biker didn't move further into the room, but he didn't retreat either. He cleared his throat. "I heard the nurses talking," he said. His voice was deep and gravelly, but surprisingly quiet. "About the little girl needing blood." Sarah straightened in her chair, suddenly alert. A mixture of hope and suspicion coursed through her. "You heard correctly," she said carefully. "My daughter needs a very rare blood type." The man nodded, his eyes drifting to Ellie's pale form on the hospital bed. Something flickered across his face, a softening that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. "I might have what she needs," he said simply. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What?" The nurse who had followed him stepped forward. "This gentleman overheard us discussing Ellie's case. He believes he has the same rare blood type." Sarah's eyes darted between the nurse and the stranger, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. "AB negative, without the K antigen?" she asked, almost afraid to hope. The biker nodded once. "That's what they tell me. Had to get some blood myself after a bad crash a few years back. Doctor made a big deal about how rare it was." Sarah stood up slowly, her legs shaky after sitting for so long. "And you're willing to—" She couldn't finish the question. "Test me," the man said, addressing both Sarah and the nurse. "Take mine. If it matches, she can have whatever she needs. The nurse stepped closer. Sir, I need to be clear. We would need to run several tests first. Blood type confirmation, disease screening, and— Do what you gotta do, he cut in. Just do it fast. Sarah moved around the bed, approaching the stranger cautiously. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the small scar above his right eyebrow, and the weariness that seemed to hang on him like a familiar coat. Why? She asked quietly. You don't know us. The man's eyes met hers briefly before looking away. Does it matter? It does to me, Sarah insisted. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with her scrutiny. Look, I was here visiting someone else. I overheard. I can help. That's all. The door opened again as another nurse entered with a clipboard. Sir, if you're serious about donating, we need to start the screening process immediately. The biker nodded, then turned back to Sarah. What's her name? He asked, gesturing toward the bed. Sarah hesitated only a moment. Ellie Carter. Something passed across the man's face, so quick Sarah almost missed it. A flash of recognition, followed by what looked strangely like guilt. I'm Jack, he said simply, extending a hand. Sarah took it after a brief hesitation. His grip was firm, but gentle. Sarah Carter. And if you're serious about this, Mr. Just Jack, he said. And yeah, I'm serious. The nurse with the clipboard gestured toward the door. We need to get started. The lab is waiting. Jack nodded and turned to follow her. At the door, he paused and looked back at Ellie. She's going to be okay, he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Sarah watched him go, then returned to her daughter's side. She sank back into the chair, her mind racing with questions about the stranger who had appeared like an answer to desperate prayers. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital grounds as Sarah waited, hope flickering to life for the first time in days. The wall clock ticked past 6 in the evening as Sarah paced the small waiting area outside Ellie's room. She'd worn a path in the linoleum floor, back and forth, stopping occasionally to peer through the window at her sleeping daughter. 3 hours had passed since the strange biker named Jack had been taken away for testing. 3 hours of hoping, 3 hours of praying, 3 hours of wondering who this man really was and why he'd appeared in their lives. Dr. Rivera, Ellie's hematologist, rounded the corner with a clipboard in hand. His face, usually carefully composed, broke into a smile. Mrs. Carter, he called, walking briskly toward her. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. Is it? She began, unable to finish the question. It's a perfect match, Dr. Rivera confirmed, his voice warm with excitement. And I mean perfect. I've never seen compatibility markers align so precisely outside of immediate family. Sarah's knees weakened, and she sank into the chair. Thank God, she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. So the transfusion? We can begin right away. Dr. Rivera nodded. The screening showed no diseases or complications. Your daughter's mystery donor is remarkably healthy for— Where is he? Sarah interrupted, looking past the doctor toward the corridor. Jack, where is he now? As if summoned by her question, the elevator doors at the end of the hall opened. Jack stepped out, rolling down his sleeve over a small bandage at the crook of his arm. He looked uncomfortable in the bright hospital lights, like a creature more accustomed to shadows. There he is, Dr. Rivera said. We took a small sample for the final cross-matching, but we'll need him for the actual donation now. Sarah stood and walked toward Jack, who stopped when he saw her approaching. His face remained impassive, but his eyes, dark and watchful, seemed to hold a question. You're a match, Sarah said, her voice catching. A perfect match. Jack nodded once, as if this was exactly what he had expected. Good. When do we start? Now if you're ready, Dr. Rivera said, joining them. We'll need to collect a unit of blood first. Then, begin the transfusion immediately. Let's do it, Jack said simply. Sarah reached out, touching Jack's arm lightly. I don't know how to thank you. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face at her touch. Don't need thanks, he muttered. Just need her to get better. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Sarah watched through the window as nurses drew blood from Jack in an adjacent room. He sat stoically in a reclining chair, his massive frame making the medical equipment look toy-like in comparison. Occasionally, his eyes would drift toward Ellie's room, his expression unreadable. By 8 o'clock, everything was ready. The precious bag of blood, Jack's blood, hung from an IV pole beside Ellie's bed. Dr. Rivera carefully checked all connections, while a nurse monitored Ellie's vitals. We'll transfuse slowly, Dr. Rivera explained to Sarah. Given her condition, we want to minimize any risk of reaction. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on her daughter's pale face. Will it work? Will this save her? The doctor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. This is her best chance, Mrs. Carter. The next few hours will tell us a lot. The door opened, and Jack stood uncertainly in the doorway. He'd removed his leather vest, wearing only a plain black t-shirt that revealed heavily tattooed arms. Can I? He started, then seemed to reconsider his words. Is it okay if I stay? Sarah looked at him. Really looked at him. Past the tattoos, past the hardened exterior, to something in his eyes that seemed almost familiar. Yes, she said softly. Please stay. Dr. Rivera nodded his approval. Actually, having the donor nearby can be helpful in case we need additional blood quickly. Jack entered the room and awkwardly took the chair opposite Sarah, on the other side of Ellie's bed. The crimson line of his blood had already begun its journey through the tubing and into Ellie's arm. In the dim light of the hospital room, with machines beeping softly in the background, they formed a strange tableau. The exhausted mother, the unconscious child, and the rough-looking biker, all connected by a thin red line that carried both blood and hope. The hospital room grew quieter as night deepened. The overhead lights had been dimmed, leaving only the soft glow from the monitors and a small lamp in the corner. Sarah had finally surrendered to exhaustion around midnight, curled awkwardly in her chair, her hand still reaching toward Ellie, even in sleep. Jack hadn't moved. 3 hours into the transfusion, he sat perfectly still, watching the slow drip of his blood through the IV line. His large frame looked out of place in the small plastic chair, but he showed no signs of discomfort. The steady beep of Ellie's heart monitor had become a rhythm he found himself breathing to, a quiet drumbeat counting the seconds of the night. A nurse slipped into the room around 1 a.m., checking Ellie's vitals and the progress of the transfusion. She glanced curiously at Jack. You should get some rest, she whispered, careful not to wake Sarah. We can call you if anything changes. Jack shook his head slightly. I'm good. The nurse adjusted Ellie's blanket, then hesitated before leaving. It's rare to see someone donate directly like this. Most people just fill out a form at a blood drive and never know where it goes. Jack's eyes remained on Ellie. Most people aren't here for a reason. The nurse didn't press further. She checked the IV bag, made a note on her clipboard, and quietly left the room. As 2 a.m. approached, Jack noticed a slight change in Ellie's breathing, softer, less labored. His gaze shifted to her face, searching for any sign of improvement. The paleness was still there, but something was different. The strain around her eyes had eased slightly. Outside the window, the night pressed dark against the glass. Jack stood carefully and stretched his stiff muscles before walking to look out at the empty parking lot below. Streetlights cast pools of yellow light on wet asphalt. It had rained while he'd been sitting vigil, and he hadn't even noticed. He turned back to study the room, the medical equipment, the child's drawings taped to the wall, a small teddy bear clutched in Ellie's arm. His world and this one seemed planets apart. Yet here he was, his blood flowing into this little girl's veins. Around 3 a.m., Sarah stirred. She blinked in confusion before her eyes found Jack, still standing by the window. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Have you been awake this whole time?" Jack nodded. "Not tired." Sarah straightened in her chair, wincing at the crick in her neck. "Any changes?" "Breathing's better," Jack said. "Nurse came by a couple hours ago. Said everything looks good." Sarah reached for Ellie's hand, checking her daughter's temperature with the instinctive touch of a mother. "She feels warmer." They fell into silence again, two strangers sharing a vigil in the small hours when hope often seems thinnest. Outside, the night sky began to soften almost imperceptibly from black to the deepest blue. At 4:30 a.m., the door opened again. Dr. Rivera entered, looking surprisingly alert despite the hour. He moved to Ellie's bedside and checked the monitors. "I was about to start my early rounds and wanted to check on our special case first," he explained, examining Ellie carefully. "Her oxygen levels are improving. Blood pressure is stabilizing." He glanced at Jack. "Your blood is doing exactly what we hoped it would." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "So she's going to be okay?" "We still have a long road ahead," Dr. Rivera cautioned, "but this is a very promising start. The next few hours will tell us more." As he left, the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the window blinds. Jack returned to his chair, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. The transfusion bag was nearly empty now. At 5:45 a.m., as the sky outside turned a gentle pink, Ellie's monitors showed a sudden change. Her heart rate strengthened. Her oxygen levels climbed steadily. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing to the screens. "Look at the numbers." Jack watched as the vital signs continued to improve, minute by minute. The steady electronic beeping seemed stronger, more insistent, less a countdown and more a celebration. As full daylight broke across the horizon, Ellie's color had visibly improved. The gray pallor had given way to the faintest flush of pink in her cheeks. Sarah reached across the bed, grasping Jack's rough hand in hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Jack looked down at their joined hands, hers small and soft, his large and calloused, then at the child between them, whose chest now rose and fell in steady, stronger breaths. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd long forgotten, the simple, powerful feeling of having done something purely good. Mid-morning sunlight streamed through the half-drawn blinds, painting warm stripes across the hospital room floor. The night shift nurses had left, replaced by the day crew who moved with quiet efficiency in the hallway outside. Jack hadn't left his post. Though the transfusion had finished hours ago, he remained seated in the uncomfortable chair beside Ellie's bed. Sarah had stepped out briefly to call her sister with the promising news, leaving Jack alone with the sleeping child. He sat perfectly still, his large frame somehow seeming less imposing in the gentle morning light. The steady beeping of the monitors had become so familiar that he barely noticed them anymore. Jack rubbed his eyes, feeling the stubble on his face. He couldn't remember the last time he'd gone so long without sleep. Yet, he felt strangely alert. His gaze drifted to Ellie's face, studying the features that looked so peaceful in rest. The deathly pallor had faded, replaced by a healthier color that spoke of life returning. A small sound drew his attention. Ellie's fingers twitched against the white hospital sheet. Jack leaned forward, watching intently as her eyelids fluttered. "Hey," he said softly, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "You waking up?" Ellie's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first. She blinked several times, confusion clear on her young face, as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Her gaze wandered until it settled on Jack, this stranger sitting beside her bed. "Mom?" Her voice was thin and raspy from disuse. "She'll be back soon," Jack answered. "She just stepped out to make a call." Ellie studied him with the direct curiosity only children possess. "Who are you?" Jack shifted in his chair, unused to explaining himself to anyone, let alone a 6-year-old girl. Name's Jack. I was helping the doctors. Ellie's small hand moved to the bandage in the crook of her arm, where the IV had been. Are you a doctor? A brief smile crossed Jack's weathered face. No, not even close. You look scary, she said matter-of-factly, with no fear in her voice. Jack nodded slightly. I know. Ellie seemed to accept this answer. Her eyes closed briefly, then opened again with effort. Though improved, she was still very weak. I was really sick. Yeah, you were, Jack confirmed. He reached for the cup of water on her bedside table. Thirsty? Ellie nodded. Jack carefully held the cup while she took a small sip through the straw. Some of the water dribbled down her chin, and he awkwardly dabbed it away with a tissue. Thank you, she whispered. Jack set the cup down and leaned back in his chair. He should go now, he thought. The girl was awake. His part was done. Yet something kept him rooted to the spot. Ellie's gaze wandered around the room before returning to him. Were you here all night? Yeah. Why? It was such a simple question, but Jack found himself without an answer he could explain. He shrugged instead. Just wanted to make sure you were okay. The movement of his arm caused his sleeve to ride up slightly, exposing the edge of a tattoo on his wrist. Ellie's eyes fixed on it immediately. What's that? She asked, curiosity brightening her tired face. Jack glanced down at his wrist, where a small, faded tattoo of a winged cross was visible. It was one of his oldest markings, barely noticeable among the more elaborate designs that covered his arms. Just an old tattoo, he replied. But Ellie was staring at it with sudden intensity. She lifted her small hand weakly, pointing. That's... Her voice faltered as she struggled to sit up slightly. Easy, Jack cautioned. Don't try to move too fast. Ellie ignored him, her eyes wide and fixed on his wrist. That's my daddy's mark. Jack froze. The air in the room seemed to still around him. What did you say? He asked, his voice rougher than he intended. My daddy had that same picture, Ellie said, still pointing at the winged cross. On his arm, just like yours. He showed me before he went to heaven. He said angels would always watch over me. Jack's throat tightened, unexpectedly. He stared at the faded ink on his skin, the symbol he and his old writing partner had gotten together years ago. A brotherhood mark that very few would recognize. Your daddy, Jack said carefully. What was his name? Michael, Ellie answered, but Mommy said his friends called him Mikey. Something cracked inside Jack's chest. Memories flooded back, of highways and late nights, of laughter and loyalty, of a promise made to a dying friend. Mikey Carter, he whispered. Ellie's eyes lit up. You knew my daddy? Jack looked into her face, really looked, and saw the echoes of his old friend. The shape of her eyes, the determined set of her chin. Yeah, he said, his voice suddenly thick. I knew him. Ellie's face glowed with sudden wonder, her illness momentarily forgotten. You really knew my daddy? Jack nodded, his weathered features softening. We rode together for years. We were... He paused, searching for words a child could understand. We were like brothers. Mommy has pictures, Ellie said, her voice growing stronger with excitement. He had a big motorcycle. It was super loud. A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips. Yeah, he liked it that way. Said if people couldn't hear him coming, what was the point? Ellie giggled softly. Then her expression turned serious. He went to heaven when I was little. Mommy says he watches over us. Jack swallowed hard. He'd never been good with emotions, had spent decades burying them beneath leather and attitude. But sitting here, looking into the eyes of his friend's daughter, those carefully constructed walls were crumbling. Your dad was a good man, Jack said quietly. One of the best I ever knew. Did you have matching pictures? Ellie pointed again to the tattoo. Jack pushed up his sleeve slightly, revealing the winged cross more fully. We got these together, a long time ago. It was special to us. Why? Jack hesitated. How could he explain to this innocent child about the brotherhood of the road, about the bonds formed between men who lived outside society's rules? It meant we'd always look out for each other, he said finally. No matter what. The door opened, and Sarah walked in, phone in hand. She stopped abruptly, surprise washing over her face when she saw her daughter awake. Ellie! She rushed to the bed, gathering her daughter in a careful embrace. Oh, sweetheart, you're awake. Mommy, Ellie said excitedly, pulling back to look at her mother's face. He knew Daddy. Sarah froze, her eyes darting to Jack with sudden wariness. What? Jack stood slowly, giving Sarah space. Your husband and I rode together, he said simply. This man has Daddy's special wing picture, Ellie continued, oblivious to the tension filling the room. The angel wings that watch over people. Sarah's face paled as she looked from Jack to her daughter, and back again. Michael never talked much about that part of his life. He left it behind for you, Jack said. For both of you. Sarah's arms tightened protectively around Ellie. Why are you here? Really? Jack looked down at the small tattoo on his wrist, running his thumb over the faded ink. The weight of a promise made years ago pressed on him. The last time I saw your husband, Jack said, choosing his words carefully with Ellie listening. He made me promise him something. Sarah's expression hardened. What kind of promise? He asked me to watch over his girls if anything ever happened to him. Jack's voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the burden he'd carried. I didn't know how to find you. I tried a few times, but you'd moved. Then life. He shrugged. Life got in the way. Until now, Sarah whispered. Until now, Jack agreed. Hearing about Ellie in the hospital, it wasn't planned, but once I knew who she was, I couldn't walk away. Ellie reached for Jack's hand, her small fingers wrapping around his rough ones. Daddy sent you to help me, she said, with absolute certainty. Jack looked at the child's trusting face and felt something shift inside him. Not knowing how to respond, he simply nodded. Sarah watched this exchange, conflicting emotions crossing her face. Relief at her daughter's improvement, battled with suspicion of this link to a past she'd tried to leave behind. Thank you for what you did, she said finally, her voice tight with restraint. But Ellie needs rest now. Jack understood the dismissal. He gently extracted his hand from Ellie's and stepped back. I should go. Will you come back tomorrow? Ellie asked hopefully. Before Jack could answer, Sarah spoke. Let's see how you're feeling tomorrow, sweetie. Jack nodded slightly to Sarah, acknowledging her boundaries. Get stronger, kid, he said to Ellie, his gruff voice gentler than Sarah had heard it before. As he turned to leave, Ellie called after him. Thank you for my daddy's blood. Jack paused at the door, not turning around. His broad shoulders tensed, then relaxed with a deep breath. Without another word, he walked out, leaving Sarah staring after him, torn between gratitude for her daughter's life and fear of what his presence might mean for their carefully rebuilt world. Morning sunlight streamed through the partially opened blinds, painting warm stripes across Ellie's hospital bed. Her color had improved overnight, a healthy pink returning to her once pale cheeks. Sarah sat in the chair beside her, helping her daughter with a small cup of applesauce, the first real food Ellie had been able to keep down in days. A soft knock on the door made them both look up. Jack stood in the doorway, his large frame seeming almost hesitant. In one hand, he held a small, worn paperback book. Jack! Ellie's face lit up, her spoon clattering into the cup. Sarah's expression was more guarded, but she nodded slightly. Good morning. Morning, Jack replied, his voice low and gravelly. Thought I'd check in. See how the kid's doing. I'm lots better, Ellie announced proudly. The doctor said your blood is super magic. A hint of a smile crossed Jack's face. Not magic. Just blood. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. Sarah noticed he wasn't wearing his leather vest today. Just a simple black t-shirt and jeans. He still looked rough and weathered, but somehow less intimidating. What's that? Ellie pointed to the book in his hand. Jack glanced down as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. Just an old book. Used to read it when I was a kid. Ellie's eyes widened. You were a kid once? This time Jack's smile was fuller, transforming his face. Hard to believe, huh? Sarah watched this exchange, puzzled by the gentleness this hardened man showed her daughter. Will you read it to me? Ellie asked, patting the edge of her bed. Please. The TV doesn't work good in here, and Mommy's voice is getting tired. Jack looked to Sarah, waiting for permission. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. I could use a coffee break, she said, standing slowly. I'll be back in 15 minutes. As she passed Jack, she added quietly, Thank you for coming back. Jack settled awkwardly into the chair Sarah had vacated. The plastic hospital chair seemed too small for his frame, but he adjusted without complaint. Ellie watched him with curious eyes. What's the story about? She asked. Jack opened the book carefully. The pages were yellowed and dog-eared, clearly read many times over many years. It's about a boy who finds a lost dog, he explained, and how they help each other. Does it have a happy ending? Ellie asked seriously. Jack nodded. The best kind. He began to read, his deep voice filling the small room. At first, he read stiffly, stumbling over words occasionally. But as the pages turned, his voice found its rhythm. The story unfolded, simple, heartfelt, about a boy who feels alone in the world until he rescues a stray dog that everyone else has given up on. Ellie listened intently, her eyes never leaving Jack's face. When he paused to turn a page, she asked, Did my daddy like stories too? Jack's hands stilled on the book. He did. He was good at telling them. Better than me. Tell me about him, Ellie said. Please? Jack closed the book, keeping his place with one finger. Your dad? He could fix anything. Motorcycles, cars, broken things. He always said there wasn't a machine made that couldn't be saved with enough patience. Ellie smiled. Mommy says, I look like him. You've got his eyes, Jack agreed, and his smile. Outside the window, clouds passed over the sun, briefly dimming the room. Jack continued reading, his voice growing more confident with each page. The story reached its climax, the dog saving the boy from danger. When Sarah returned, carrying 2 coffee cups, she handed one to Jack, who accepted it with surprise. Figured you might need this, she said simply. By late afternoon, they had finished the book. Ellie had drifted off to sleep halfway through the final chapter, but Jack had continued reading softly until the end. As evening approached and visiting hours neared their end, Ellie woke. She seemed disappointed to have missed the ending. Did they stay together forever? The boy and the dog? Yeah, Jack said, tucking the book into her blanket. They did. Will you come back tomorrow? Ellie asked, yawning. Maybe with another story. Jack glanced at Sarah, who gave a small nod. I promise, he said softly, standing up. Get some rest, kid. Morning arrived with the clatter of breakfast trays and the squeak of nurses' shoes on the hospital floor. Sarah had spent the night in the uncomfortable recliner beside Ellie's bed, her neck stiff from the awkward position. She was helping Ellie with her breakfast when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Jack stood there, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. In his hands, he held a small paper bag. Morning, he said with a nod. Jack. Ellie's face brightened instantly. She pushed away her half-eaten toast. You came back. Said I would, didn't I? He stepped into the room, looking more rested than he had the day before. He wore a clean flannel shirt over a simple gray t-shirt. Sarah smiled cautiously. "Good morning." Jack approached the bed and held out the paper bag to Ellie. "Brought you something." Ellie's eyes widened as she accepted the gift. "What is it?" "Open it and see," Jack said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. Ellie carefully opened the bag and pulled out a small, stuffed dog. It was brown, with floppy ears and a red bandana around its neck. Nothing fancy or expensive, but Ellie clutched it to her chest, as if it were made of gold. "He looks just like the dog in the story," she exclaimed. Jack nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "Saw it in the gift shop downstairs." Sarah watched the exchange quietly. There was something about seeing this rough man bringing her daughter such a simple, thoughtful gift that touched her deeply. "What's his name?" Ellie asked, examining the stuffed animal closely. "That's up to you, kid," Jack replied. Ellie thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm going to call him Buddy, like in the story." "Good name," Jack agreed. A nurse came in to check Ellie's vitals, smiling at the new stuffed animal. "Well, who's this handsome fellow?" "Buddy," Ellie announced proudly. "Jack gave him to me." The nurse checked Ellie's temperature and blood pressure, noting the readings on her chart. "Your numbers look great today, sweetie. Dr. Williams will be by soon." After the nurse left, Ellie asked Jack, "Can you tell me another story about my daddy?" Jack glanced at Sarah, who nodded her permission. "Your dad," Jack began, leaning forward in his chair, "was the best mechanic I ever knew. One time, we were on a long ride through Nevada, and this guy's bike broke down in the middle of nowhere. No phone, no town for miles. Your dad fixed it with a paperclip and a piece of gum." Ellie giggled. "No way." "True story," Jack insisted, the corner of his mouth lifting. He could work miracles with engines. Throughout the morning, Jack shared small, careful stories about Ellie's father. The funny ones, the kind ones. He left out the rougher parts, the dangerous rides, the bar fights. Sarah appreciated his discretion. When lunchtime came, Jack stood up. "I should get going." "Do you have to?" Ellie asked, still clutching her new stuffed dog. "Got some things to take care of," Jack said, "but I'll be back." "Promise?" Ellie held out her pinky finger. Jack looked at it for a moment, then carefully hooked his much larger pinky around hers. "Promise." After he left, Ellie played with Buddy, making up adventures for him. Her energy was better today, her appetite returning. Sarah watched her daughter, marveling at the change in her spirits. That night, after Ellie had fallen asleep, Sarah stood by the window, looking out at the hospital parking lot below. She spotted Jack's motorcycle, instantly recognizable among the cars. He was still here, somewhere in the building. She thought about the man who had given his blood to save her daughter, who had kept a promise to a friend long gone, who brought stuffed animals and shared gentle stories. Sarah had spent years building walls around herself and Ellie after her husband died, protecting them from the world he'd left behind. But now, watching her daughter sleep peacefully, with a simple stuffed dog tucked under her arm, she felt those walls beginning to crumble. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to trust again. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to let this unexpected guardian into their lives, if only for a while. The next morning arrived with sunshine streaming through the hospital window, casting warm squares of light on Ellie's bed. The little girl was propped up with an extra pillow, her color better than it had been in days. She held Buddy, the stuffed dog, in her lap, occasionally adjusting his red bandana. Sarah had just finished helping Ellie with her breakfast when they heard the now familiar heavy footsteps in the hallway. "Jack!" Ellie called out before he even appeared in the doorway. He stepped into the room, nodding a greeting. Today, he wore a plain black t-shirt that revealed more of his tattoos along his arms. In one hand, he carried a small paper bag. "How's the patient today?" he asked, his gruff voice softer than usual. "Doctor said my numbers are better," Ellie announced proudly. "Is that so?" Jack settled into what was becoming his regular chair. He placed the paper bag on the edge of the bed. "Brought you something." Ellie eagerly reached for the bag and pulled out a small coloring book with motorcycles on the cover and a pack of crayons. "Cool," she exclaimed, immediately opening it. "Look, Mom," Sarah smiled. "That's very thoughtful, Jack. Thank you." Jack shrugged. "Figured she might be getting bored in here?" Ellie flipped through the pages, examining each motorcycle with great interest. "Did my daddy have a motorcycle like these?" "He sure did," Jack said, leaning closer to look at the book. He pointed to a classic cruiser. "His was kind of like this one, but blue. Called it Blue Thunder." "That's a funny name," Ellie giggled. "Your dad had a funny side," Jack said. "Remember this one time? We stopped at this little diner in Arizona. Your dad ordered pancakes, and when they came, he arranged them to look like a face." Ellie laughed, her eyes bright with interest. "Really?" "Yep, used bacon for the smile, blueberries for the eyes. Then he talked to it before eating it." Jack demonstrated a deep voice. "Sorry, Mr. Pancake, but you look too delicious." Ellie burst into laughter, a sound that filled the room like music. Sarah found herself laughing too, imagining her late husband's antics. "Tell me more," Ellie begged, setting aside the coloring book. Jack thought for a moment. "Well, there was this one time we were camping, and your dad was convinced he saw Bigfoot." "Did he?" Ellie asked, eyes wide. "Nope. Turned out to be a big black bear standing on its hind legs. Your dad took off running so fast he left one boot behind." Ellie collapsed into giggles again. "One boot?" "One boot," Jack confirmed, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Had to ride back to town in mismatched footwear." For the next hour, Jack shared gentle, funny stories about Ellie's father. With each tale, Ellie's laughter grew stronger, more vibrant. Sarah watched in amazement as her daughter's eyes sparkled with joy, her cheeks flushed with healthy color. "Did you and Daddy ever race your motorcycles?" Ellie asked, now coloring a page in her new book. "Sometimes, but only in safe places," Jack answered carefully, glancing at Sarah. "Your dad was always real careful." "Was he faster than you?" Jack pretended to be offended. "No way. I was the speed king." "The first bet he let you win," Ellie said wisely, making Sarah snort with unexpected laughter. Jack looked surprised, then chuckled. "You know, kid, you might be right about that." By lunchtime, Nurse Jenny came in with Ellie's medication and a lunch tray. She paused, noticing the cheerful atmosphere in the room. "My goodness, someone's looking brighter today," she remarked, checking Ellie's pulse and temperature. "These are the best readings we've seen yet." Ellie held up her coloring book. "Jack brought me this, and he's telling me stories about my daddy." "Is that so?" Nurse Jenny glanced at Jack with a warm smile, then made notes in Ellie's chart. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working wonders. Dr. Williams will be pleased." After checking Ellie's IV, Nurse Jenny pulled Sarah aside near the doorway. "Her vitals are significantly improved today," she said quietly. "Her blood counts are stabilizing. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I can tell you the right visitor can sometimes do more good than medicine." Sarah looked back at the bed, where Jack was pointing out details in Ellie's coloring as the little girl giggled at something he'd said. "I've noticed she seems better when he's around," Sarah admitted. Nurse Jenny nodded. "It's not just the numbers. Look at her face. That's the face of a child who's healing." She patted Sarah's arm. "Whatever's happening here, it's good medicine." Morning sunlight filtered through the thin hospital curtains, casting the room in a gentle glow. Ellie sat up in bed, her small hands clutching colored pencils as Jack pulled his chair closer to her bedside table. "No, silly," Ellie giggled, pointing to Jack's drawing. "Horses don't have 5 legs." Jack examined his artwork with mock seriousness. "That's not a leg. It's a tail." The tail goes on the back end, Ellie explained patiently. She took his paper and drew a proper tail in the right spot. See? Like this. Well, I never claimed to be an artist, Jack said. His gruff voice softened around the edges. Your turn. Show me how it's done. Sarah watched from the doorway, coffee cup in hand, amazed at the transformation in her daughter. Just days ago, Ellie had been barely conscious, her skin pale as moonlight. Now color bloomed in her cheeks, and her laughter filled the room like music. Mom! Ellie called out when she spotted Sarah. Look what Jack taught me. She held up a paper where she had drawn a surprisingly good daisy. He says my dad used to draw these for my mom. Did Daddy draw flowers for you? Sarah stepped into the room, setting her coffee on the nightstand. He did. How did you know that? She looked at Jack with curiosity. Jack shifted in his chair. He'd doodle them on napkins, receipts, anything he could find. Said they were easier than buying real ones when he was on the road. I kept every single one, Sarah said softly. Jack nodded, then turned his attention back to Ellie. Want to learn something else your dad was good at? He took a blank sheet of paper and began folding it carefully. What are you making? Ellie asked, leaning forward to watch his large hands work with surprising delicacy. Paper airplane. Your dad could make one that would fly across an entire parking lot. Jack's fingers creased and folded until a perfect paper airplane sat in his palm. He handed it to Ellie, who immediately sent it soaring across the room. Again, she squealed when it landed near the bathroom door. For the next hour, Jack helped Ellie create an entire fleet of paper airplanes. They tested different designs, laughing when some nosedived immediately, while others glided gracefully across the room. Sarah joined in, remembering how her husband had indeed made these same creations for Ellie when she was smaller. When lunchtime came, Ellie was tired but happy. After eating half her sandwich, she dozed off with a paper airplane still clutched in her hand. Sarah and Jack stepped out into the hallway to let her rest. Thank you, Sarah said quietly. I haven't seen her this happy since before she got sick. Jack nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. Just keeping busy. They walked together to the small waiting area at the end of the hall. The evening sky outside the window was turning purple and orange as the sun began to set. He really drew those flowers for me everywhere we went, Sarah said after a moment of silence. Once he even spray-painted a huge daisy on our garage when I was having a bad day. The neighbors were scandalized. She smiled at the memory. Jack chuckled. That sounds like him. He was always doing things his own way. How did you two meet? Sarah asked, sitting down in one of the vinyl chairs. Jack leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. Bike rally in Sturgis, 15 years ago. My bike broke down, and he was the only one who stopped to help. Spent 3 hours in the rain fixing it with me. Sarah's eyes softened. That was Mike, always stopping for strays. I wasn't exactly a stray, Jack said with a hint of defensiveness. No. Sarah raised an eyebrow. He had a knack for finding people who needed something, even when they didn't know it themselves. Jack was quiet for a long moment. He talked about you and Ellie all the time, carried your pictures everywhere. Really? Sarah's voice caught. Said he hit the jackpot when he found you. Wanted to give you both everything. Sarah wiped away a tear. He did. Every day we had with him. As the evening shadows lengthened outside, they continued sharing memories of the man who had connected them, Sarah's husband, Jack's friend, painting a fuller picture of him between them, like artists working on the same canvas from different sides. The next morning arrived with the gentle hum of hospital routine. Nurses changed shifts, breakfast trays clattered down hallways, and the antiseptic smell hung in the air like always. Jack stood at the window of Ellie's room, sipping bitter coffee from a paper cup. Behind him, Ellie slept peacefully, her breathing steady and strong, stronger than it had been in days. Sarah had gone home to shower and change clothes, promising to return soon. The temporary solitude gave Jack a moment to breathe, to think about the unexpected turn his life had taken. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Jack checked the screen and frowned. It was Viper, his club's vice president. He stepped into the hallway to answer. "Yeah." Jack kept his voice low. "Where the hell have you been, man?" Viper's voice boomed through the speaker. 3 days with no check-in? That ain't like you." Jack glanced back toward Ellie's room. "Something came up." "Something more important than the club?" The edge in Viper's voice was unmistakable. "We got business tonight. That shipment from Carson City is coming in, and we need all hands." Jack rubbed his temple, feeling the pressure building. The shipment. Parts for bikes, mostly legal, some not. They'd been planning this run for weeks. "I can't make it," Jack said. Silence filled the line for several seconds. "What do you mean you can't make it?" Viper's voice dropped dangerously low. "This ain't optional, Jack. You know the rules." Jack walked further down the hallway, away from Ellie's door. "I'm at the hospital." "You hurt?" Concern briefly replaced anger. "No, it's complicated." "Uncomplicate," Viper snapped. "The president wants everyone at the clubhouse by noon. Planning meeting before the run tonight." Jack checked his watch. 9:30. He'd promised Ellie he'd be there when she woke up, and Sarah would be back soon. The thought of leaving made his stomach twist. "I got obligations here," Jack said finally. "Obligations?" Viper laughed without humor. "Your only obligation is to your brothers. 20 years wearing those colors, and suddenly something's more important. What's going on with you?" Jack watched a young nurse wheel an elderly patient past him. Life happening all around him. Life he'd never paid attention to before. "Remember Mike Carter?" Jack asked. "Carter? That guy who left the life about 7 years back? What about him?" "His kid is sick. Real sick. I'm helping out." Viper was quiet for a moment. "Carter's been dead for years, man. Since when do you play charity worker?" "It's not like that," Jack said, feeling defensive. "I made him a promise." "A promise?" Viper's voice rose again. "Your promises to your brothers come first. Always. You know that." Jack leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of two worlds pulling him in opposite directions. The club had been his life, his identity, for more than half his existence. They were family when he had none. But in Ellie's room was something different, something pure that made him feel human again. "Jack, you there?" Viper demanded. "Yeah, I hear you." "So you'll be at the clubhouse at noon. This isn't a request." Jack closed his eyes. "I can't leave right now." "Can't or won't?" Viper's voice turned cold. "The president ain't gonna like this. You're putting me in a bad position here." "Tell him I'll explain later," Jack said, knowing how weak it sounded. "Later don't cut it. You're either with us or you ain't." The implied threat hung between them. Jack knew the rules. The club came first. Always. No exceptions. His phone buzzed with a text. "Sarah. On my way back. Ellie's asking for you." "I gotta go," Jack said into the phone. "Jack." He ended the call and silenced his phone, sliding it back into his pocket. His chest felt tight, like his kuta suddenly weighed 100 pounds. When he returned to Ellie's room, she was awake, sitting up in bed with the television playing softly. "Jack!" Her face lit up. "I was scared you left." "Nah," he said, settling back into the chair beside her bed. "Just stepped out for a minute." "Good," she said, reaching for his hand. "The doctor says maybe I can try walking in the hallway today." Jack felt his phone vibrate again in his pocket. And again. He ignored it, focusing instead on Ellie's excited chatter about getting out of bed. By the time noon arrived, his phone had fallen silent. Jack remained seated beside Ellie, teaching her to play a card game his grandmother had shown him decades ago. Sarah returned with a bag of fresh clothes for Ellie and a grateful smile for Jack. Outside, the world continued spinning. But inside room 312, Jack had made his choice. Evening crept through the hospital windows as the corridor lights dimmed for the night shift. The pediatric wing settled into a gentle hush, broken only by the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on the polished floor. Jack sat beside Ellie's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath. She'd had a good day. The doctors were pleased with her progress, and she'd managed to walk halfway down the hall before her legs grew tired. Her small face, once gray and sunken, now showed hints of color returning to her cheeks. Across from him, Sarah had finally surrendered to exhaustion. She slept awkwardly in the vinyl recliner, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, a thin hospital blanket pulled up to her chin. Jack silently stood and adjusted the blanket over her shoulders. She stirred, but didn't wake. Returning to his chair, Jack felt the weight of his phone in his pocket. He hadn't checked it in hours, not since the barrage of messages and missed calls had finally stopped. The silence from the club was more threatening than any angry voicemail. He knew what it meant. 20 years in the life had taught him the rules. You didn't ignore a call to meet. You didn't put anything before the club. And you sure as hell didn't skip a run without consequences. Jack rubbed his face with calloused hands. His fingers trailed over the scars and lines that told the story of his life. A life lived hard and fast, with loyalty to his brothers above all else. That had been his code, his religion. Until now. He glanced at Ellie's stuffed bear tucked under her arm, the one he'd brought her 3 days ago. It seemed like a lifetime had passed since then, since before he knew who she was, before he remembered his promise to Mike. His thoughts drifted to Mike Carter, a good man who'd found the strength to leave the life behind for love. Jack had respected him for it, even as the club had turned its back. Now he understood Mike's choice, in ways he never could have before. The digital clock on the wall clicked forward. 9:37 p.m. The shipment would be moving now. His brothers would be on the road without him, and his absence would be noted, marked, remembered. Jack stood and paced to the window. The hospital parking lot glowed under sodium lights. His bike sat alone in the far corner, chrome gleaming dully. Freedom and obligation, all wrapped up in steel and leather. He turned back to look at Ellie, this little girl who carried Mike's blood, and now his own. The connection between them was something he couldn't explain, not to Viper, not to anyone in the club. How could they understand when he barely understood it himself? "You look sad." Ellie's soft voice startled him. Jack moved quickly back to her bedside. "Hey, kiddo, thought you were asleep." She yawned and clutched her bear tighter. "I was, but then I woke up." "You should go back to sleep. Get your rest." Ellie studied his face with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. "Are your biker friends mad at you?" Jack blinked in surprise. "What makes you ask that?" "I heard you talking on your phone. You sounded upset." Jack sat down on the edge of her bed, careful not to disturb her IV line. "Grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about. Is it because you're here with me instead of with them?" Her eyes were wide and serious. Jack hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Something like that. You could go if you need to." Her small fingers found his rough hand. "I'll be okay." The simple gesture hit Jack like a physical blow. This child was willing to let him go, to put his needs before her own. The contrast between her selflessness and what the club demanded of him was stark. "I'm right where I need to be," Jack said, his voice rougher than usual. Ellie smiled and her eyes grew heavy again. "Good. I like having you here." Within minutes, she had drifted back to sleep, her face relaxed and trusting. Jack watched her for a long while, feeling something shift inside him, something fundamental breaking loose and reforming. He stood quietly and slipped out of the room. He needed air, space to think. The night was cool as Jack pushed through the hospital's automatic doors. He walked to his bike and ran his hand over the worn leather seat. 20 years of loyalty, of brotherhood, of belonging. 20 years of being Jack Iron Callahan, respected and feared. Now he stood alone in a hospital parking lot, caught between the man he'd been and the man a little girl needed him to be. Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, warming the quiet room. Sarah stirred in the uncomfortable recliner, her neck stiff from another night spent watching over Ellie. She blinked, surprised to see her daughter already awake, quietly coloring in a book Jack had brought her yesterday. "Morning, sweetie," Sarah said, stretching. "How long have you been up?" Ellie looked up with a smile brighter than Sarah had seen in weeks. "Not long. Jack brought breakfast." Sarah noticed the empty pudding cup on the tray and a small carton of apple juice. "The nurse said it was okay," Ellie added quickly, seeing her mother's questioning look. Sarah nodded, running her fingers through her tangled hair. "Where is Jack now?" "He went to get coffee. He said your eyes looked tired." Sarah couldn't help but smile at that. For all his rough edges, Jack seemed to notice things others missed. A gentle knock at the door interrupted them. A woman in a neat blazer with a hospital badge stood in the doorway. "Ms. Carter, I'm Diane from patient billing. Could I speak with you for a moment? It shouldn't take long." Sarah's heart sank. The bills. With everything happening with Ellie, she'd managed to push that worry to the back of her mind. But reality always caught up eventually. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ellie, I'll be right back, okay?" "Okay, Mommy," Ellie said, already absorbed in her coloring again. Sarah followed Diane down the corridor, past the nurse's station, and into a small office with filing cabinets and a desk covered in paperwork. Her palms were sweaty. The insurance would cover some costs, but she knew the specialized treatments for Ellie's rare condition went well beyond what her policy would pay. She'd been bracing herself for this moment, the conversation about payment plans that would likely follow her for years. "Please, have a seat," Diane said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Sarah sat, clutching her purse. "I know we need to discuss payment arrangements. I've been meaning to come down." "Actually, Ms. Carter," Diane interrupted gently, "that's not why I called you in today." She tapped at her computer keyboard and turned the screen slightly. "I wanted to inform you that your daughter's medical bills have been settled in full." Sarah stared at the woman, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "All of Ellie's medical expenses have been paid," Diane repeated, her smile warm, "including the projected costs for her remaining treatments and follow-up care." "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "The insurance wouldn't cover all that. There must be some mistake." Diane shook her head. "No mistake. The payment was processed yesterday afternoon. It's all taken care of." Sarah felt lightheaded. "But who would—" She stopped herself, a sudden realization hitting her. "Was it— Can you tell me who made the payment?" Diane hesitated. "The donor requested anonymity, Ms. Carter. I can only tell you that it was a private individual, not an organization or charity." Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Jack. It had to be Jack. But how? The bills would be astronomical, tens of thousands of dollars at least. "Is there anything else I need to sign or do?" Sarah asked, still dazed. "No. Everything's been handled," Diane replied, handing her a folder. "These are copies of the statements showing the zero balance. For your records." Sarah took the folder with trembling hands. "Thank you." Walking back to Ellie's room, Sarah felt as if she were moving through a dream. The burden that had been crushing her for months had suddenly lifted, leaving her weightless and disoriented. When she reached Ellie's doorway, she paused. Jack was back, sitting in his usual chair beside Ellie's bed. He was helping her with a page in her coloring book, his large hand awkwardly holding a tiny pink crayon, while Ellie giggled at his efforts. Sarah watched them, tears welling in her eyes. It had to be him. But why? And how could he possibly have that kind of money? She wiped her eyes quickly before entering the room, the folder clutched tightly against her chest. She would find the right moment to ask him. For now, she simply watched as this man, this stranger who had saved her daughter's life twice over, continued to color carefully within the lines, as if it were the most important task in the world. Later that afternoon, Ellie dozed peacefully after lunch, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The monitors beeped quietly, a reassuring sound that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Sarah watched Jack as he carefully arranged Ellie's stuffed animals around her, making sure her favorite teddy bear was tucked securely under her arm. When he finished, Sarah nodded toward the door. "Can we talk for a minute? In the hall?" Jack's expression flickered with uncertainty, but he nodded. "Sure." They stepped into the hallway, moving a few paces away from Ellie's door. Sarah clutched the folder from the billing department against her chest like a shield. For a moment, she just looked at him. This rugged man with tattoos peeking from beneath his shirt sleeves and 3 days of stubble darkening his jaw. A man who'd somehow become essential to their lives in such a short time. "I got called to the billing department this morning," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. Jack's face remained impassive, but his eyes darted away from hers, focusing on a spot over her shoulder. "They told me all of Ellie's medical bills have been paid. Every single one." Sarah paused, taking a deep breath. "Was that you, Jack?" He shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her direct gaze. "Don't worry about it." "Don't worry about it?" Sarah repeated, disbelief coloring her words. "We're talking about thousands of dollars. How could you possibly afford that?" Jack ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly tired. "I had some money saved." "Some money?" Sarah pressed, stepping closer. "This isn't just some money. These are massive medical bills." A nurse walked by, glancing curiously at them. Jack gently took Sarah's elbow and guided her toward a small waiting area at the end of the hall. It was empty, offering them a moment of privacy. "Look," he said, his voice low and gruff. "I've been saving for years. Had a plan to get out. Start over somewhere new, that's all." Sarah's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You used your escape money? Your fresh start?" Jack shrugged, as if it were nothing, but Sarah could see the weight of the decision in the set of his shoulders. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for us? You barely know us." Jack looked down at his hands, large, calloused hands that had seen hard work and harder living. "I knew your husband. He saved my life once, you know. Not just with a transfusion or anything fancy like that. He just believed in me when nobody else did." He paused, swallowing hard. "When I promised to look after you and Ellie, I meant it. Took me too long to find you, but I meant it." Sarah stood speechless, the folder now hanging limply at her side. "Besides," Jack continued, his voice softening, "that little girl in there, she deserves a chance. A real chance without you having to worry about hospital bills for the next 20 years. "But what about your fresh start? Your plans?" Sarah asked. Jack looked back toward Ellie's room, a faint smile touching his lips. "Maybe this is my fresh start. Just not the way I planned it." The evening sun slanted through the windows, painting the stark hospital corridor in warm gold. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a wall crumbling, a door opening. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't," Jack replied simply. "Your husband gave me a second chance once. This is me, finally earning it." Sarah reached out tentatively, placing her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, then relaxed. For a moment they stood there in silent understanding, the folder of receipts between them representing so much more than paid bills. It was sacrifice, redemption, and perhaps the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. The morning sunlight streamed through the partially open blinds, casting golden stripes across Ellie's hospital bed. For the first time in weeks, The room buzzed with an energy that felt different, hopeful, expectant. Dr. Rivera stood at the foot of the bed, flipping through charts with a satisfied smile on her face. "Well, Ellie," she said, looking up at the little girl who sat propped against her pillows. "Your numbers look great. Your blood counts are stable and you're responding beautifully to treatment." Sarah, who had been organizing Ellie's few belongings, froze mid-fold of a small nightgown. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Dr. Rivera nodded, her dark eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm clearing Ellie for discharge. You can take her home today." Ellie's thin face lit up. "Really? I can go home?" Her voice, still weak but filled with excitement, seemed to fill the entire room. She looked around quickly. "Where's Jack? I have to tell Jack." As if summoned by her words, there was a soft knock at the door. Jack stood in the doorway, wearing a clean button-up shirt instead of his usual t-shirt. In his hands, he clutched a small gift bag with tissue paper poking out the top. "Tell Jack what?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm going home." Ellie bounced slightly on the bed, wincing a little but too excited to care. "Doctor says I can leave today." Jack's weathered face broke into a rare, full smile that transformed him. "That's so?" He looked to Dr. Rivera for confirmation, and when she nodded, he stepped further into the room. "Well then, guess this is good timing." He handed the gift bag to Ellie. With eager fingers, Ellie pulled out the tissue paper and reached inside. She gasped as she pulled out a small leather bracelet, carefully handcrafted with her name tooled into it. "Made it myself," Jack said, suddenly looking unsure. "Thought you might like something to remember, you know." "It's beautiful," Ellie whispered, running her fingers over the letters of her name. She immediately thrust her wrist toward him. "Put it on me?" As Jack fastened the bracelet around Ellie's tiny wrist, Sarah watched the careful, gentle way his large fingers worked the clasp. The same hands that had probably thrown punches in bar fights were now treating her daughter's arm like it was made of glass. "We need to celebrate," Sarah announced, blinking back unexpected tears. "A proper going-home party." Dr. Rivera smiled. "I'll let the nurses know. They always like to make a fuss when our long-term patients go home. Give me a couple of hours to process the paperwork, and you'll be all set." The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Nurses came in to check Ellie's vitals one last time, and to help her change into regular clothes. A soft pink dress Sarah had brought from home. Each staff member who had cared for Ellie stopped by to wish her well. "Look at you, ready for the runway," exclaimed Nurse Jenny, the night shift nurse who had been with them from the beginning. She adjusted the small backpack on Ellie's shoulders, filled with cards and small gifts from the hospital staff. By early afternoon, a small crowd had gathered in Ellie's room. The nurses had brought balloons and a small cake with "Fly-Free Ellie," written in wobbly blue frosting. Even Dr. Rivera returned, having completed her rounds. "Before you go," announced Nurse Jenny, "we have a little tradition here." She produced a small bell and handed it to Ellie. "When our brave patients finish their stay with us, they get to ring the freedom bell." Ellie looked at the bell with wide eyes, then glanced at Sarah and Jack, who stood side by side near her bed. "Go on, sweetheart," Sarah encouraged. Jack nodded. "Give it a good ring." With a determined smile, Ellie shook the bell. Its clear, bright sound rang through the room, and everyone broke into applause. Nurses dabbed at their eyes, and even Jack looked away for a moment, clearing his throat. Dr. Rivera stepped forward with a wheelchair. "Your chariot awaits, Princess Ellie." "Do I have to use that?" Ellie frowned. "I can walk." "Hospital rules," Dr. Rivera said with a wink. "Everyone gets the royal treatment on their way out." As Jack helped lift Ellie into the wheelchair, Sarah looked around the room that had been their world for so many weeks. The beeping machines, the sterile walls, the window with its limited view, all had become strangely familiar. Now they were leaving it behind, stepping into a new chapter filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. The golden light of early evening bathed the small yellow house in a warm glow as Sarah's car pulled into the driveway. Jack followed close behind on his motorcycle, the rumble of the engine announcing their arrival to the quiet neighborhood. "We're home, baby," Sarah said, glancing at Ellie in the rearview mirror. Ellie pressed her face against the window, her eyes bright with excitement, despite the exhaustion that lined her small face. "It looks different," she whispered. "That's because you haven't seen it in weeks," Sarah replied, unbuckling her seatbelt. "Everything looks a little different when you've been away." Jack parked his motorcycle behind them and approached the car. He opened the back door and knelt down to Ellie's level. "Ready to go inside, kiddo?" Ellie nodded, then lifted her arms toward him in a silent request. Without hesitation, Jack gathered her up carefully, mindful of the IV port still in her arm that would need to stay for her ongoing treatments. "I got you," he said quietly. "Nice and easy." Sarah hurried ahead with bags and opened the front door. "Welcome home," she called out, her voice breaking slightly. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh flowers. A handmade banner hung across the living room reading, "Welcome home, Ellie," in bright, childish letters, the work of neighborhood children who had heard of her return. "Look at that," Jack said, nodding toward the banner. "Looks like you're a celebrity around here." Ellie giggled as Jack carried her to the sofa and gently set her down. She looked around the familiar space with wide eyes, as if seeing it for the first time. "It's so big after the hospital room." "And no more beeping machines," Sarah added, setting down the bags. "I'll make us some dinner. Are you hungry, sweetheart?" "A little," Ellie admitted. She looked up at Jack. "Will you stay for dinner?" Jack hesitated, glancing at Sarah. "Of course he will," Sarah said, surprising both Jack and herself. "It's a celebration, after all." Jack nodded, his face softening. "Sure thing. I'll stay." While Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, Jack helped Ellie settle on the sofa with pillows and her favorite blanket, which had been freshly washed and smelled of fabric softener. He turned on the television and found a cartoon channel that made Ellie smile. "This is way better than hospital TV," Ellie declared, snuggling deeper into the cushions. Jack chuckled. "I bet." He sat beside her, his large frame making the sofa dip slightly. For a while, they watched the colorful characters bounce across the screen in comfortable silence. Jack noticed Ellie fighting to keep her eyes open, her head nodding forward before jerking back up. "Tired?" he asked. "No," she insisted, even as her eyelids drooped. "Just resting my eyes." Jack's mouth twitched in a smile. "Right." From the kitchen came the homey sounds of cooking, pots clanging, water running, the refrigerator door opening and closing. The normalcy of it all felt strange to Jack, who was more accustomed to the noise of bars and motorcycle engines than domestic tranquility. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Dinner in 15 minutes. Mac and cheese with chicken nuggets, Ellie's favorite." "Sounds perfect," Jack said. The three of them ate dinner together at the small kitchen table. Ellie managed only a few bites before her exhaustion became too much to ignore. Her head began to droop over her plate. "I think someone needs bed," Sarah said gently, stroking Ellie's hair. "No," Ellie protested weakly. "I'm not tired." Jack exchanged a look with Sarah. "Tell you what," he said to Ellie. "How about I carry you to your room, and you can show me all your stuff before you go to sleep?" This compromise seemed acceptable to Ellie. Jack carefully lifted her again and followed Sarah's directions to a small bedroom painted in pale yellow with butterfly decals on the walls. He placed Ellie on the bed, which was covered with a colorful quilt and stuffed animals. Sarah helped Ellie change into pajamas in the bathroom, while Jack waited awkwardly in the hallway. When they emerged, Ellie was clean-faced and ready for bed. "Jack," Ellie said as Sarah tucked her in, "can you stay a little longer? Please?" Jack glanced at his watch. It was getting late, and he knew he should go, but the pleading look in Ellie's eyes made it impossible to refuse. "Sure," he said. "I can stay a bit longer." "Will you tell me a story?" Ellie asked, patting the edge of her bed. Jack sat down carefully. I don't really know any good stories. Tell me one about my dad, Ellie suggested, her eyes suddenly serious. Please. Jack cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. Well, one time, your dad and I were riding through the mountains, and we came across this little dog. As Jack's deep voice spun a gentle version of an old memory, Ellie's eyes grew heavier. By the time he finished, she was fast asleep, her small chest rising and falling peacefully. Jack stood quietly and made his way to the door where Sarah waited. I should go, he whispered. Sarah nodded, walking him to the front door. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. Jack nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. I'll check in tomorrow if that's okay. We'd like that, Sarah replied. With a final glance toward Ellie's room, Jack stepped out into the night, closing the door softly behind him. The morning sunlight filtered through Ellie's curtains, casting patterns across her bedroom floor. She opened her eyes slowly, taking a moment to remember she was home, not in the hospital with its beeping machines and antiseptic smell. A smile spread across her face as she stretched carefully under her butterfly quilt. Jack, she whispered to herself, excitement bubbling up inside her. Ellie pushed herself up against her pillows, wincing slightly at the tenderness in her arm where the IV port remained. She glanced at her bedside clock. 7:45 a.m. Not too early. Jack might already be here. Mom, she called, her voice still raspy from sleep. Sarah appeared in the doorway moments later, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Good morning, sweetheart. How are you feeling? Good, Ellie said, already looking past her mother toward the hallway. Is Jack here? Sarah's smile faltered slightly. Not yet, honey. It's still pretty early. But he's coming, right? Ellie asked, her eyes wide with certainty. I'm sure he'll come by later, Sarah assured her, moving to sit on the edge of Ellie's bed. He probably has some things to take care of first. Remember, he has a life outside the hospital too. Ellie nodded, though disappointment clouded her face momentarily. Can I wait for him in the living room? Sarah helped Ellie out of bed and into her favorite pink robe. Together, they made their way to the living room, where Sarah settled Ellie on the couch with a bowl of cereal and the TV remote. I'm going to make some coffee, Sarah said, kissing the top of Ellie's head. Call if you need anything, okay? Ellie nodded absently, her attention already divided between her cereal and the cartoons on TV. But every few minutes, her eyes would drift to the front window, watching for the familiar shape of Jack's motorcycle. Morning stretched into afternoon. Ellie had moved from the couch to the kitchen table, where she was coloring in a book Jack had brought her at the hospital. She looked up at every sound. A car passing by, the neighbor's dog barking, the mail carrier's footsteps, hoping each might be Jack. When do you think he'll come? She asked Sarah for what felt like the 100th time. Sarah glanced at the clock. It was already 2:30 p.m. I don't know, sweetheart. He didn't say exactly when. Maybe he's buying me a present, Ellie suggested, her face brightening at the thought. Sarah smiled. Maybe. But as the afternoon wore on, even Ellie's optimism began to waver. She grew quieter, her coloring less enthusiastic. By 4 o'clock, she had abandoned her coloring book altogether and returned to the couch, her gaze fixed on the window. Do you want a snack? Sarah asked, trying to distract her. Ellie shook her head. I'm not hungry. Sarah sat beside her daughter, pulling her close. Honey, Jack might be busy today. He might not be able to come at all. But he said he would check on me, Ellie protested, her bottom lip trembling slightly. He promised. Sometimes grown-ups have things come up, Sarah explained gently. Things they can't control. Did you call him? Ellie asked. Sarah hesitated. The truth was, she didn't have Jack's number. Their entire relationship had been confined to the hospital. She had no way to reach him. No, sweetie, I don't have his number, she admitted. Oh. Ellie's voice was small. By dinner time, the sky outside had begun to darken. Sarah made Ellie's second favorite meal, spaghetti with extra cheese, but Ellie merely pushed it around her plate. "Maybe he's coming later," Ellie suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe after dinner." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, not wanting to crush her daughter's hope entirely. After dinner, Ellie insisted on staying up a little longer. She sat by the window in her pajamas, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the street grow darker as night settled in. Each set of headlights that passed made her sit up straighter, only to slump back down when they continued past their house. "I think it's time for bed, sweetheart," Sarah said at last, when Ellie's eyelids had grown heavy despite her determination to stay awake. "But what if he comes after I'm asleep?" Ellie asked, her voice catching. "Then he'll come back tomorrow," Sarah promised, though she wasn't at all sure that was true. As Sarah tucked Ellie into bed, she noticed a tear sliding down her daughter's cheek. "He's not coming, is he?" Ellie whispered. Sarah brushed the tear away with her thumb. "I don't know, baby. But what I do know is that you need your rest." Ellie turned her face toward the wall, her shoulders shaking slightly with silent tears. "He promised," she whispered. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Ellie's mood as she pushed her scrambled eggs around her plate. She hadn't slept well, waking several times during the night, convinced she'd heard Jack's motorcycle rumbling outside. Each time, she'd found only darkness and silence. "Do you think Jack will come today?" Ellie asked, her voice small against the patter of rain on the kitchen window. Sarah looked up from her coffee, her expression carefully neutral. "I don't know, sweetie." "But why didn't he come yesterday? He promised." Ellie's lower lip quivered slightly. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Sometimes people have things come up. Important things they can't get out of." "More important than me?" The hurt in Ellie's eyes made Sarah's heart ache. "No, honey. Nothing's more important than you." Sarah hesitated, unsure how to explain the complicated world of adults to a 6-year-old. "But Jack has responsibilities. Just like everyone. Maybe something happened that he couldn't control." Ellie pushed her plate away, unconvinced. "Can we call him?" Sarah shook her head. "I told you last night, I don't have his number. Can we go find him? He rides a motorcycle. It's big and black with silver parts." "Sweetie, there are lots of motorcycles like that. And we don't know where he lives." Ellie slumped in her chair, defeat written across her face. "But he knew Daddy. Daddy would know where to find him." The mention of her late husband sent a pang through Sarah's chest. "Yes, he would," she agreed softly. Throughout the morning, Ellie kept returning to the window, pressing her nose against the glass each time she heard a car passing by. Every disappointment seemed to dim her spirits further. By lunchtime, she'd grown listless, picking at her sandwich without interest. "How about we watch a movie?" Sarah suggested, desperate to see her daughter smile again. Ellie shrugged. "What if Jack comes while we're watching and we don't hear him?" "We'll leave the volume low," Sarah promised. They settled on the couch together, Ellie wrapped in her favorite blanket, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. The movie played, but Sarah could tell Ellie wasn't really watching. Her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the door. Halfway through the film, the doorbell rang. Ellie bolted upright, her blanket falling to the floor as she scrambled off the couch. "It's Jack! Mom, it's Jack!" "Wait, honey!" Sarah called, but Ellie was already racing to the door, her small feet slapping against the hardwood floor. Sarah hurried after her, reaching the door just as Ellie stretched for the handle. She gently moved her daughter aside and peered through the peephole. A delivery person stood on the porch, holding a small package. Sarah opened the door, trying to hide her disappointment for Ellie's sake. "Delivery for Ellie Carter," the young woman announced, consulting her clipboard. Ellie's eyes widened. "For me?" Sarah signed for the package, thanked the delivery person, and closed the door. She handed the small box to Ellie, who took it with trembling fingers. "Who's it from?" Ellie asked, turning the package over in her hands. There was no return address, just Ellie's name and their address printed in neat block letters. "I'm not sure," Sarah said. "Let's open it and see." They returned to the couch, and Ellie carefully unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a small wooden box with a butterfly carved on the lid. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered. Ellie traced the butterfly with her fingertip, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft fabric, lay a delicate leather bracelet, hand-braided and fitted with a small silver charm. A tiny motorcycle. A folded note sat beneath it. Sarah took it out and read aloud. "For my brave little friend. Sorry I couldn't bring this myself. Jack." Ellie's face lit up, the first real smile Sarah had seen since leaving the hospital. She carefully lifted the bracelet from the box, holding it like a treasure. "He didn't forget me," she whispered, slipping the bracelet onto her wrist. It fit perfectly. For the rest of the day, Ellie's mood brightened. She still asked about Jack, still wondered when he might come, but the edge of hurt had softened. The bracelet seemed to reassure her in a way Sarah's words couldn't. That night, as Sarah tucked her daughter into bed, Ellie held her wrist up to the nightlight, watching the silver motorcycle charm catch the glow. "Mom, do you think Jack is okay?" she asked sleepily. "I'm sure he is," Sarah replied, smoothing Ellie's hair back from her forehead. "I hope he comes tomorrow," Ellie murmured, her eyelids growing heavy. Sarah kissed her daughter's cheek. "Get some rest, sweetheart." As Ellie drifted off to sleep, her fingers curled protectively around the leather bracelet, her last conscious thought a prayer that Jack would return soon. Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, washing the breakfast dishes, while watching Ellie through the window. Her daughter sat cross-legged on the backyard swing, slowly pushing herself back and forth with one foot, while her other hand constantly touched the leather bracelet on her wrist. Though Ellie looked better than yesterday, there was still a quietness about her that hadn't been there before Jack's disappearance. Steam rose from the soapy water as Sarah scrubbed a plate with more force than necessary. The package yesterday had been a temporary comfort, but it hadn't answered the real question. Why had Jack vanished so completely? And why now, just when Ellie was getting better? "He saved her life," Sarah whispered to herself, rinsing suds from a coffee mug. "He paid her medical bills, and then he just left." None of it made sense. The Jack she'd come to know over those hospital days wasn't someone who would abandon a child who had grown attached to him, especially not after revealing his promise to her husband. Sarah dried her hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter, memories washing over her. She recalled how Jack had sat beside Ellie's bed for hours, his large frame somehow fitting into the small hospital chair. How his rough hands had gently helped Ellie hold a cup when she was too weak to manage it herself. How his gravelly voice had softened when reading her stories. These weren't the actions of someone who didn't care. These were the actions of someone who cared deeply. The realization hit her suddenly. Maybe that was exactly why he'd left. Sarah walked to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, her mind racing. Jack wasn't just any man. He was a Hell's Angel. She'd seen enough of the patches on his vest to understand what that meant. His life existed in a world completely separate from theirs, a world with its own rules and dangers. She thought about the phone calls he'd ignored while sitting with Ellie, the way he'd stepped outside to take calls, returning with tension etched into his face. How sometimes he'd looked over his shoulder when they walked through the hospital parking lot. What if his sudden disappearance wasn't abandonment, but protection? Sarah reached for her phone, scrolling through local news stories from the past few days. Nothing about motorcycle gangs or incidents involving the Hells Angels appeared. But that didn't mean something wasn't brewing under the surface. Through the window, she watched Ellie absently spin on the swing, the sunlight catching on her bracelet. The child who had been so critically ill just weeks ago was now playing outside, breathing fresh air, getting stronger every day. All because a stranger, a man from her husband's troubled past, had walked into their lives at exactly the right moment. Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. What if Jack had realized his presence might eventually bring danger to their doorstep? What if staying away was his final act of keeping his promise? "Oh, Jack," she murmured, pressing her fingers to her lips. She remembered his face the last time she'd seen him, standing in their living room after helping bring Ellie home. There had been something in his eyes, a look she hadn't been able to interpret at the time. Not sadness exactly, but resolution, as if he'd made a difficult decision. Sarah went to the front window, gazing out at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, Jack was living his life. A life he'd briefly stepped away from to honor a promise. A life he'd return to, perhaps to keep them safe from it. The package with the bracelet made more sense now. It wasn't just a gift. It was a goodbye. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a complex mixture of gratitude and loss. Jack had given Ellie back her future. He'd given Sarah back her daughter. And then he'd given them one more thing: distance from whatever troubled world he inhabited. As the afternoon sun warmed the living room, Sarah came to a bittersweet understanding. Jack's absence wasn't a betrayal or abandonment. It was, in its own way, another form of protection. Another way of keeping his promise. Sarah closed the photo album on her lap, tracing her finger across its worn cover. Evening shadows stretched across the living room as she put away the memories of happier times. Pictures of Ellie as a baby, of her husband smiling, of a life before illness and uncertainty. Ellie had finally fallen asleep after another day of asking when Jack would return. Sarah had run out of gentle explanations that wouldn't break her daughter's heart. "Sometimes people have to go away, even when they don't want to," she'd said, smoothing Ellie's hair as the little girl clutched her stuffed animal. The house felt too quiet now. Sarah moved to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of tea, watching steam curl upward in the dim light. She hadn't turned on many lamps. Somehow the darkness felt comforting tonight, a place to hide her confusion and disappointment. She was just about to take her first sip when she heard it. A soft knock at the front door. Sarah froze. It was nearly 8 in the evening, too late for casual visitors. Her neighbors rarely stopped by unannounced. For a moment, her heart raced with worry. Had something happened at the hospital? Had Ellie's test results come back with concerns? The knock came again, slightly louder, but still hesitant. She set her tea down and moved cautiously toward the door. Through the peephole, she saw a figure standing on the porch, backlit by the streetlight. The broad shoulders were unmistakable, even without the leather vest. Jack. Sarah's hand trembled as she unlocked the door. When she pulled it open, the sight of him standing there stole her breath. He looked different. His hair was trimmed shorter, and instead of his usual biker clothes, he wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans. But his face held the same intensity she remembered, his eyes finding hers immediately. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and rough, as if he hadn't used it in days. She couldn't speak. 1,000 questions rushed through her mind, but none made it to her lips. Jack shifted his weight, suddenly looking unsure of himself, an expression she'd never seen on his face before. "I'm sorry for showing up like this. I know it's late." "You disappeared," Sarah finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ellie has been asking for you every day." Pain flickered across his features. "I know. I'm sorry for that too." A car passed by on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating his face more clearly. Sarah noticed a fading bruise near his jawline. "What happened to you?" she asked. Jack glanced down at the porch steps. "May I come in?" "Just for a minute." Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside. Jack entered cautiously, like a man entering unfamiliar territory. He stood awkwardly in the entryway, seeming too large for the small space. "Is she asleep?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "Just finally went down." She wore herself out, asking when her guardian biker would come back. Jack closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the impact of her words. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady. "I had to leave," he said simply, "but not because I wanted to." "Then why?" Sarah crossed her arms, protective of herself, of Ellie, of the fragile peace they'd been trying to rebuild. Jack took a deep breath. "Because I needed to finish something first. I needed to make sure when I came back, if you'd let me come back, that I was bringing only myself, not my past, not my problems." "What does that mean?" Jack met her gaze directly. "It means I'm not a Hell's Angel anymore. I walked away. For good." The weight of his words filled the quiet space between them. Sarah understood enough about motorcycle clubs to know what walking away meant, what it cost. "They let you leave?" she asked softly. A shadow crossed his face. "Not exactly. But it's done now." A soft creak from the hallway drew their attention. There, standing in her pink pajamas with tiny unicorns, was Ellie. Her eyes widened at the sight of Jack, her small mouth falling open in surprise. "Jack?" she whispered, as if afraid he might disappear if she spoke too loudly. Jack knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her eye level. "Hey, kiddo." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Ellie's face bloomed with pure joy. She raced across the living room, her bare feet pattering against the hardwood floor. "Jack, you came back." She flung herself into his arms with complete trust, nearly knocking him backward. Jack caught her gently, his large hands steadying her small frame as she wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. "I knew you'd come back," she murmured against his shoulder. "I told Mom you would." Jack closed his eyes, holding her carefully, like something precious that might break. Over Ellie's shoulder, his gaze met Sarah's. The emotion in his eyes was raw and unguarded. "I promised, didn't I?" he said softly, though whether to Ellie or to her father's memory, Sarah couldn't tell. Ellie pulled back, her small hands holding Jack's face as she examined him seriously. "Where did you go?" "I waited and waited." Jack gently tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "I had to take care of some things. Important things." "More important than me?" she asked, her bottom lip pushing out slightly. "No," Jack answered without hesitation. "Nothing's more important than you. That's why I had to go, so I could come back the right way." Sarah watched this exchange, her heart tightening in her chest. The hardened man she'd first met in the hospital seemed transformed by her daughter's unconditional acceptance. Or maybe he'd always been this man underneath, and Ellie simply saw what others missed. "Are you hungry, Jack?" Ellie asked suddenly, perking up. "Mom made lasagna. It's really good." Sarah hadn't planned on company, but found herself saying, "There's plenty, if you'd like to stay for dinner." Jack stood up slowly, Ellie still clinging to his hand. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Please stay," Ellie begged, tugging his arm. "Please, please, please." A hint of a smile touched Jack's lips. Hard to argue with that. The kitchen was warm and bright, compared to the dim living room. Sarah busied herself reheating the food, while Ellie chattered excitedly to Jack about everything he'd missed. Her new drawings, how the cat from next door had visited their yard, the book her teacher had sent home. Jack listened intently, as if each detail was vital information. He sat at their small kitchen table, looking both out of place and exactly where he belonged. Sarah placed plates before them, the steam rising from the food filling the kitchen with a homey scent. For a moment, nobody moved. The three of them paused at this unexpected tableau they'd created. "We say grace first," Ellie informed Jack seriously, holding out her small hands to both adults. Sarah took her daughter's hand, then hesitantly extended her other hand toward Jack. He looked at it for a moment, before carefully taking it in his much larger one. The circuit completed. They bowed their heads as Ellie recited her simple prayer. "Thank you for the food and for making me better, and for bringing Jack back to us. Amen." "Amen," Sarah echoed softly. Jack didn't say the word, but he squeezed Sarah's hand gently before letting go. They ate together, the conversation flowing more easily than Sarah would have expected. Ellie dominated the talk, but occasionally Jack would share a carefully edited story that made the little girl giggle. Sarah found herself laughing too, surprised by Jack's dry humor. As night settled fully outside the windows, the kitchen glowed with warmth and light. Sarah watched Jack help Ellie cut her lasagna into smaller bites without being asked. She saw how his eyes softened when her daughter smiled at him. She noticed how carefully he listened when either of them spoke. In this simple meal, shared around her kitchen table, Sarah felt something shift, felt the edges of their separate lives begin to overlap and form something new. Not quite a family yet, but the beginnings of one. Different from what she had planned, different from what she had lost, but real and warm and full of possibility. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window the next morning, casting warm rectangles of light across the worn linoleum floor. Sarah stood at the counter pouring coffee when she heard the knock. 3 gentle taps, just like yesterday. She smiled to herself and called out, "It's open, Jack." The door creaked open, and Jack stepped inside, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. He'd traded his usual leather jacket for a simple flannel shirt, and his hair was neatly combed back. "Morning," he said, holding up a small paper bag. "Brought some donuts. Wasn't sure what kind Ellie likes." "Chocolate with sprinkles," Sarah and Jack said simultaneously. They shared a surprised look. Then Sarah laughed softly. "Her dad always knew that too," she said, her voice warm with memory rather than painful. "Coffee?" Jack nodded gratefully and took the mug she offered. His eyes scanned the kitchen, noticing the leaky faucet, the cabinet door hanging slightly crooked. "That sink giving you trouble?" he asked, setting his mug down. Sarah sighed. "For months now. I've been meaning to call someone, but with Ellie's medical bills." She trailed off, then smiled. "Well, I guess that's not an issue anymore. Thanks to you." Jack waved away her thanks, already rolling up his sleeves. "Got tools in my truck. Won't take me 10 minutes to fix." Before she could respond, the patter of small feet announced Ellie's arrival. She appeared in her favorite unicorn pajamas, hair wild from sleep. When she spotted Jack, her whole face lit up. "You came back again," she exclaimed, rushing to hug him. "Said I would, didn't I?" Jack replied, his gruff voice softening as he patted her back awkwardly. "Are you staying for breakfast?" Ellie asked, eyeing the donut bag hopefully. "Breakfast first, then donuts," Sarah interjected with a mother's firmness. "And yes, Jack is staying. He's going to fix our sink." Ellie clapped her hands. "Can I help? Daddy used to let me hold his tools." A shadow crossed Jack's face, brief, but Sarah caught it. "Sure thing, kiddo," he said, recovering quickly. "Every good mechanic needs an assistant." After breakfast, Sarah watched from the doorway as Jack knelt under the sink, patiently explaining each tool to Ellie as she handed them to him. His large, calloused hands worked with surprising gentleness on the pipes, and his deep voice remained steady and patient with Ellie's endless questions. "You're really good with her," Sarah said later, after the sink was fixed, and Jack had moved on to rehanging the cabinet door. Jack paused, a screwdriver in his hand. "Never thought I would be," he admitted. "Never been around kids much." "Well, you're a natural," she replied, handing him a glass of lemonade. The day unfolded with a comfortable rhythm that felt both new and somehow familiar. Jack tackled small repairs around the house that Sarah had been putting off for months, while Ellie followed him like a shadow, chattering away. By afternoon, he'd fixed the wobbly porch step, replaced a burned-out porch light, and was helping Sarah move some heavy furniture she'd been wanting to rearrange. "You don't have to do all this," Sarah said, as they pushed the couch to its new spot. Jack shrugged. Got nothing better to do. But his eyes told a different story, one of a man who'd found purpose after being adrift for too long. As evening approached, they worked together in the kitchen preparing dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and meatballs. But the simple domesticity of it struck Sarah deeply. Jack stirred the sauce while she boiled the pasta, and Ellie set the table, placing 3 plates with careful precision. "This is nice," Ellie declared as they sat down to eat. "Like a real family." Sarah caught Jack's eye across the table, expecting discomfort at Ellie's words. Instead, she found something that looked remarkably like hope. After dinner, as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, they sat on the porch swing. Ellie nestled between them, a book in her lap. She pointed to a picture, then looked up at Jack with a smile that mirrored her father's. "Uncle Jack, can you read this part? You do the funny voices better." The title, Uncle Jack, hung in the air for a moment. Jack blinked rapidly, his weathered face softening with emotion. Then he cleared his throat and gently took the book from her hands. "Sure thing, kiddo," he said softly, his voice steady despite the depth of feeling behind it. As he began to read, his arms settled around Ellie's small shoulders, and he caught Sarah's gaze over the child's head. In that quiet evening moment, with crickets chirping and the porch swing gently creaking, Jack nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of acceptance, of belonging, of embracing this new life that had found him when he least expected it. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.